In 1944, a King County psychiatrist sat across from a 30-year-old woman in a Washington state courthouse and told the assembled hearing that she was suffering from manic depressive psychosis, which he considered the probable forerunner of a definite dementia praecox. The headline writers translated this for the following morning's newspapers: "Her sanity held in doubt." The woman sitting across from that psychiatrist had, 3 years earlier, been called by critics the most naturally gifted actress in Hollywood. She had starred opposite Bing Crosby, performed on Broadway to universal acclaim, and been offered a 7-year contract by Paramount Pictures after a screen test that made the studio's talent chief say, in writing, you couldn't take your eyes off her. By 1944, she was being committed to Western State Hospital in Steilacoom, Washington, on the signature of her own mother. She would spend most of the next 6 years inside its walls. She would be subjected to electroconvulsive shock treatment. She would be given daily comas through insulin injection. She would later describe what was done to her in language so precise and so unflinching that it was almost impossible to read. When she was finally released in 1950, she was not the same person. She could not be. What had been done to her inside those institutions had changed something so fundamental that it could not be changed back. She spent the remaining years of her life working in a hotel in Indianapolis, hosting a small television show, and dying of cancer at 56, largely forgotten by the industry that had once called her irreplaceable. Her name was Frances Farmer. And what happened to her is one of the most disturbing stories in the history of Hollywood. Not because it was unusual, but because, in 1944, it was entirely legal. Before we go further, if stories like this move you, stories about women the system was designed to destroy, subscribe to Behind the Pearls and turn on notifications. Every week we open the locket on a woman history tried to reduce to a single headline. Now back to Frances. She was born Frances Elena Farmer on September 19, 1913, in Seattle, Washington, the daughter of Ernest Farmer, a lawyer, and his wife Lillian Van Ornum. The marriage was not a stable one. Her parents separated when Frances was 4 years old. She spent several years moving between her mother's household in California and her father's in Seattle, developing, she later said, the particular survival skill of a child who is shunted between homes and must constantly find new ways to adapt to new rules without losing herself in the process. Seattle in the 1910s and 1920s was a city with a strong progressive political tradition, and Frances grew up absorbing it. Her mother Lillian was not a warm woman by most accounts, but she was an ambitious one, and she recognized early that Frances had talents worth developing. She arranged voice lessons, piano lessons, encouraged her daughter's gift for performance. Frances was a serious, bookish child who compensated for the instability of her home life by writing and reading with a ferocity that impressed her teachers. She made her stage debut at 14. She was, by every account from people who knew her at this age, already extraordinary in the specific way that makes a room of adults pay attention to a teenager. In her senior year of high school, she entered a writing competition run by a national magazine. She wrote an essay titled, "God Dies." In it, she argued with the confident, provocative clarity of a 17-year-old who has read enough and thought enough to have arrived at conclusions that made adults deeply uncomfortable. That God was not real, that religion was a human construction, and that she saw no evidence of divine order in the world as she had experienced it. She won first prize. The conservative community of Seattle reacted with outrage. Baptist ministers denounced her from their pulpits. Local officials called the essay unpatriotic. The girl who had written it was called a communist, an atheist, a bad influence. Newspaper editorials asked what kind of mother allowed her daughter to hold such views. Frances Farmer did not apologize. The more people pointed at me in scorn, she said years later, the more stubborn I got. And when they began calling me the bad girl of West Seattle High, I tried to live up to it. This response is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is the key to everything that followed in her life. In 1930, a 17-year-old girl won a National Writing Prize for a sophisticated philosophical argument about the non-existence of God, was condemned by her community for it, and responded not by moderating her position, but by doubling down. Most people, confronted with that level of community pressure at that age, would find a way to soften the edges, to add a qualifier, to make peace. Frances Farmer concluded instead that the community was wrong, and she held that conclusion for the rest of her life, extending it in different forms to Hollywood, to the studio system, to the psychiatric establishment that eventually tried to redefine her character as illness. She was not without flaw. She was not without damage. But the refusal to capitulate to pressure that the world around her consistently read as instability was, by any honest measure, one of the most consistent expressions of genuine intellectual integrity in her entire biography. Years later, at a function in Seattle, where she had been invited as a returning celebrity, she encountered the Baptist minister who had spoken out against her essay from his pulpit. He was now eager to be photographed with her. She looked at him and said, "I am the freak from West Seattle High." Then she walked away. She was still the same person. The community had simply changed its assessment of whether that was an asset or a liability. This quality of defiant refusal to perform acceptable femininity in the face of social pressure, to simply refuse to become what the room required of her, was the defining characteristic of Frances Farmer's entire life. It was what made her extraordinary in every context she entered. And it was precisely what would eventually be used to destroy her. In 1935, the left-leaning Seattle newspaper The Voice of Action ran a subscription contest. The prize was a trip to the Soviet Union. Frances entered the contest, won, and went to Moscow alone at 21 years old, which was itself sufficient cause for several more rounds of denunciation from Seattle's establishment. When she returned from Moscow in the summer of 1935, she was supposed to travel back to Seattle. Instead, she cashed in her bus ticket and went to New York, with the intention of building a career in the theater on the strength of what she actually had, rather than what she could pretend to have. What she had was considerable. She was uncommonly beautiful, in a way the camera adored: deep voice, striking eyes, a quality of absolute presence that translated from stage to film with no loss of force. Within weeks of arriving in New York, she had been connected to a Paramount talent scout. The screen test she gave was described as extraordinary. She signed a 7-year contract with Paramount Pictures and moved to Hollywood on her 22nd birthday. Her first assignment at Paramount was a film called Too Many Parents, a B picture of no particular distinction. She did not distinguish herself in it either, largely because it gave her nothing to work with. But the studio was patient, because what they had seen in her screen test told them to be patient. The film that changed everything was Come and Get It, a 1936 Samuel Goldwyn production directed by Howard Hawks and William Wyler, based on Edna Ferber's novel. Frances Farmer played a dual role, a saloon singer and her daughter, in a performance that critics almost unanimously agreed was something beyond what the film itself deserved. She was nominated for nothing and won nothing, because the industry of the 1930s was not yet in the habit of lavishing recognition on women who made everything around them look smaller than it was. But the people who knew how to evaluate acting talent noted what she had done and wrote it down. She also appeared in Rhythm on the Range alongside Bing Crosby, one of the biggest stars on the planet. He reportedly told people afterward that she was the most gifted actress he had worked with. This was not the kind of thing Bing Crosby said carelessly. But Hollywood, for all its recognition of her talent, could not contain Frances Farmer in the way it needed to contain an actress under contract. She was not interested in performing the role of the compliant starlet. She refused to attend the social events Paramount required of its contracted players. She did not conceal her political opinions, which were considerably to the left of the studio establishment. She argued about the roles she was assigned. She asked questions she was not supposed to ask. Paramount studio head Adolph Zukor reportedly called her personally to tell her that now that she was a rising star, she would have to start acting like one. Frances Farmer remained exactly who she was. In 1937, she left Hollywood temporarily for New York, where she had been invited by Harold Clurman to star in the Group Theater's premiere production of Clifford Odets's play Golden Boy. The Group Theater was the most intellectually serious theater company in America at that moment, a collective of artists whose commitment to politically engaged, psychologically rigorous drama was completely unlike anything Hollywood produced. Frances Farmer thrived in it. Her performance in Golden Boy was universally praised. She was, by every critical account from that season, the most compelling presence on the New York stage. She was also, by her own account, deeply happy in a way she was not in Hollywood. The Group Theater talked about ideas. It took acting seriously as an art form rather than a commercial product. It did not require her to pretend to be a different kind of woman than she was. She could not stay. Her Paramount contract pulled her back to Los Angeles, and in the years that followed, the gap between what she was capable of and what Hollywood was willing to let her do grew steadily wider and steadily more damaging. The specific texture of that gap is worth understanding, because it explains a great deal about what happened next. Paramount had signed Frances Farmer because she was extraordinary. And then, having signed her, they proceeded to cast her in films that did not require her to be extraordinary. Films that required her to be beautiful and present and compliant. Films where the direction was simple and the material was thin and the job was to turn up, hit the marks, and not cause problems. Frances Farmer was constitutionally incapable of the last item on that list, not because she was unreasonable, but because she had standards that the films being offered to her did not meet, and she could not pretend otherwise. She fought about scripts. She argued about interpretations. She questioned decisions that her directors and producers considered settled. In Hollywood in the 1930s and 1940s, an actress who argued was not described as having artistic integrity. She was described as difficult. The word spread through the studio system the way all such words spread, quietly, as a warning passed between men at lunch, until it reached every corner of the industry and became the frame through which everything Frances Farmer subsequently did was interpreted. She was aware of this. The more people pointed at me in scorn, she had said in Seattle, the more stubborn I got. The pattern held. Every new round of industry disapproval produced, in Frances Farmer, a further entrenchment rather than a capitulation. She was not going to become what they wanted. Not for Paramount, not for the columnists who wrote about her with barely concealed hostility, and not for the social machinery of Hollywood that required its actresses to perform a version of themselves that was palatable to the men who paid for everything. She married actor Leif Erikson in 1936. The marriage was, by most accounts, one of the more stable periods of her adult life, but stability was relative. By the early 1940s, the marriage was dissolving, and Frances was drinking with an intensity that she herself later acknowledged had become a serious problem. She was 30 years old. She had been in Hollywood for 5 years. The career that had seemed so brilliant and so inevitable in 1936 had been steadily eroded by the accumulated friction between who she was and what the industry required. What had also been eroded, though this was less visible to anyone outside her immediate circle, was the psychological scaffolding that had always supported her defiance. The stubbornness that had made her admirable was increasingly underpinned by something more fragile. The drinking was not a cause of her deterioration. It was a symptom of it. She was not falling apart because she drank. She was drinking because something was falling apart. None of this was treated, because the tools for treating it did not yet exist in any meaningful form in 1942, and because the people around her, including the studio system that had employed her, were not interested in treatment. They were interested in compliance. She married actor Leif Erikson in 1936. The marriage was troubled from early on, and the couple divorced in 1942. By that point, Frances Farmer was drinking heavily. Her behavior on film sets had become difficult to manage from the studio's perspective, which in practice meant that she arrived with opinions, argued about directorial decisions, and refused to perform the social compliance that the system demanded. The trigger for everything that followed was, on its surface, almost absurdly minor. In October 1942, Frances Farmer was stopped by police in Santa Monica for driving with her headlights on bright during a wartime blackout restriction that applied to the West Coast. She was unable to produce a driver's license, was verbally combative with the officers who stopped her, and was held overnight. She was fined $500 and given a 180-day suspended sentence. She paid half the fine immediately and was placed on probation. What happened next was a cascade of institutional consequences that no reasonable reading of the initial offense could have predicted or justified. She failed to pay the remaining half of the fine. A bench warrant was issued. She did not appear in court. Meanwhile, on a film set in early 1943, she got into a physical altercation with a hairdresser who had, by some accounts, interrupted her while she was sleeping in her dressing room. The hairdresser filed a complaint. The complaint triggered the bench warrant. Frances Farmer was arrested in January 1943, taken to court, and, in one of the most famous images from this entire episode, photographed being dragged into the courtroom, disheveled and resisting. Those photographs ran in newspapers across the country. The coverage was not sympathetic. A psychiatrist who examined her in custody diagnosed her with manic depressive psychosis. She was committed to the Screen Actors Sanitarium at La Crescenta in the San Fernando Valley. What happened at La Crescenta is documented in Frances Farmer's own words, which she set down in a memoir she wrote decades later. She described the insulin shock treatment she received there as a brutal physical attack, which not only stunned the brain cells, but shocked the body as well, and left the patient racked with nausea and pain. She complained about it so persistently and so specifically that her mother eventually succeeded in having her released. This is the moment that requires the most careful attention in this entire story. Lillian Farmer fought to have her daughter released from the sanitarium in California. She won. Frances went home to Seattle with her mother in September 1943. And then, within 6 months, Lillian Farmer had her own daughter recommitted. The relationship between Frances and her mother was, by Frances's own account, one of mutual exhaustion and accumulated fury. "We were enemies who had grown tired of pretending," she wrote of the period immediately after her return to Seattle. "They fought constantly. The fighting eventually became physical. Frances attacked her mother. Her mother called the police. In March 1944, at a King County Superior Court sanity hearing, 2 psychiatrists testified that Frances Elena Farmer was legally insane. One of them gave the diagnosis that made the newspapers. Her mother filed the paperwork. On January 31, 1944, Frances Farmer was committed to Western State Hospital in Steilacoom, Washington. She was 30 years old. She had been one of the most celebrated actresses in America 7 years earlier. She would not leave Western State as a free woman for 6 years. Western State Hospital in the 1940s was not a treatment facility in any sense we would recognize today. It was an institution built to contain people the community had decided were too inconvenient, too difficult, or too frightening to remain at liberty. It was dramatically overcrowded. The wards were, by multiple accounts including Farmer's own, chaotic, unsanitary, and inadequately staffed. Frances Farmer described the ward as a place where patients were often left unattended or restrained. She alleged being beaten by staff. She alleged sexual abuse. Some of her specific claims have been disputed by historians and by the institution itself in later years. But what is not disputed, because it is documented in the hospital's own records, is that she received electroconvulsive shock treatment and was subjected to hydrotherapy, which in the 1940s meant being forcibly held in tubs of cold water for extended periods. She was released briefly in the summer of 1944, pronounced completely cured after 3 months, and returned to her mother's custody. The cure did not hold, which in the institutional logic of the era was further evidence of her condition rather than evidence of the inadequacy of the treatment. She was recommitted, and released, and recommitted again. The cycle repeated itself across the better part of 6 years, each hospitalization taking something from her that was not restored on release. A rumor that has persisted in accounts of Frances Farmer's life since the 1970s is that she was lobotomized during her time at Western State. This claim was introduced in 1978 in a book by William Arnold and has since been repeated in films, plays, and countless articles. It is important to be honest about the evidence here. Medical historians and researchers who have examined the available records have found no documentation supporting the claim that a lobotomy was performed on Frances Farmer. The records that exist indicate electroconvulsive therapy and insulin shock therapy. The lobotomy claim appears to be unsubstantiated. This matters not because the truth is less disturbing than the myth, but because it is disturbing in a different, and in some ways, more relevant way. The treatments that were documented, the electroconvulsive therapy, the insulin shock that she described as leaving her racked with nausea and pain, the years of institutionalization in overcrowded wards were not exceptional. They were standard. They were what was routinely done to women in the 1940s, who were classified as mentally ill. The horror of what happened to Frances Farmer is not that someone did something unusual to her. It is that everything done to her was completely ordinary. The years at Western State left Frances Farmer with a document. Not a legal document, not a diagnosis, but a human document, the account she eventually compiled of what it had looked and felt like from the inside, written in language so precise it reads less like a memoir than like forensic testimony. She described the ward as a place where patients outnumbered staff by ratios that made individual care effectively impossible, where people were restrained, sedated, and left unattended for hours in conditions of real physical squalor, where the medical model in use assumed that what needed to be treated was the behavior rather than anything that might be causing it, and that the most efficient way to treat the behavior was to make the person incapable of producing it. The electroconvulsive therapy she received involved passing electrical current through the brain to induce a seizure. In the 1940s, this was done without the anesthetic and muscle relaxants that were introduced later, which meant that patients experienced the seizure fully, were sometimes injured by the convulsions, and woke with no memory of what had been done to them, but with the physical aftermath of it still in their bodies. Frances Farmer received this treatment multiple times. The hospital records confirm it. The insulin shock therapy she had received earlier, at La Crescenta, she described in her own words as a brutal physical attack. Large doses of insulin were administered to drive the blood sugar low enough to produce a coma. The patient was then brought out of the coma, usually with glucose. This was repeated daily. The theory was that repeated comas would somehow reorganize the brain in a way that eliminated the symptoms being treated. The evidence for this was always thin. The evidence that it caused harm was overwhelming to anyone willing to look. She alleged in her memoir physical beatings by staff. She alleged sexual abuse. Some of these specific claims have been contested. What is certain is that the conditions she described were not exceptional for state psychiatric institutions of that era. Overcrowding, inadequate staffing, and routine dehumanization of patients were documented by investigators and journalists throughout the 1940s and 1950s in facilities across the country. Western State Hospital was not a uniquely terrible place. It was a representative one. The most devastating thing about the 6 years Frances Farmer spent inside the system was not any single treatment or any single act of cruelty. It was the accumulation, the sheer attrition of years in which she was defined entirely by her diagnosis, in which her perceptions were automatically suspect because she was classified as ill, in which she had no privacy, no autonomy, no recourse, and no reliable advocate outside those walls. Her mother visited. Her father visited less. Hollywood did not visit at all. In 1950, Frances Farmer was released from Western State Hospital for the last time. She was 36 years old. She had been inside institutions for most of the previous 6 years. She was not the person who had gone in. You cannot give a person daily comas, apply electrodes to their skull repeatedly, confine them in overcrowded wards for years, and have them emerge unchanged. The brilliant, combative, intellectually ferocious young woman who had held the New York stage and made Bing Crosby reach for superlatives had been altered by what was done to her in ways she herself spent the rest of her life trying to understand and describe. She did not go back to Hollywood immediately. For several years, she lived quietly, trying to rebuild some version of an ordinary life. She worked. She married twice more. Briefly and unhappily. She began to write about her experiences. In 1957, she was discovered by a talent agent who recognized that there was still an audience for Frances Farmer, even if it was now the television audience rather than the film audience. She appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. She appeared on This Is Your Life. She hosted her own television program, Frances Farmer Presents, which ran in Indianapolis for 6 years beginning in 1958. The Indianapolis years are the most poignant chapter of her story in some ways, because they are the chapter in which she is most herself again. She was a professional. She was capable. She had opinions. She engaged with the work seriously. The people who worked with her on Frances Farmer Presents described a woman of considerable intelligence and warmth who had been through something she did not entirely discuss, but that was visible in the particular quality of her resilience. She was also, during this period, working on the memoir that would become her most lasting document. Will There Really Be a Morning, published posthumously in 1972, is one of the most important first-person accounts of what life inside a 1940s psychiatric institution actually looked like from the inside. "Never console yourself into believing that the terror has passed," she wrote, "for it looms as large and evil today as it did in the despicable era of Bedlam. But I must relate the horrors as I recall them, in the hope that some force for mankind might be moved to relieve forever the unfortunate creatures who are still imprisoned in the back wards of decaying institutions." She was still thinking about the people she had left behind. She was still angry on their behalf. Whatever had been done to her had not taken that. In 1964, she was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. She died on August 1st, 1970, in Indianapolis, Indiana. She was 56 years old. Her death received modest coverage. She was remembered, where she was remembered at all, primarily as a cautionary tale about a difficult woman who had been unable to manage the pressures of Hollywood. The word difficult appeared in almost every obituary. It always had. In 1978, the book that introduced the lobotomy rumor reignited public interest in her story. In 1982, the film Frances, starring Jessica Lange in an Academy Award-nominated performance, brought her story to a mass audience for the first time. The film included the lobotomy scene, despite the lack of documentary evidence for it, because it was dramatically potent. And in 1993, Kurt Cobain wrote a song called Frances Farmer Will Have Her Revenge on Seattle for Nirvana's album In Utero. The song included these lines: "She'll come back as fire, to burn all the liars, and leave a blanket of ash on the ground." His daughter, born that same year, he named Frances Bean Cobain. The song and the daughter's name tell you something important. By 1993, Frances Farmer had become a symbol for something larger than her own story. She had become the emblem of every woman who was too much for the room she was in, who refused to make herself smaller, who said what she thought and was punished for it in ways that the room called treatment and the law called care. History needs to hold both things at once about Frances Farmer. She had genuine problems. She was drinking heavily by the early 1940s. Her behavior was, by multiple accounts including her own, sometimes erratic and sometimes violent. The world of 1943 had extremely limited tools for understanding or treating whatever she was actually experiencing, and the people around her, including her mother, were operating with the understanding and the resources available to them in that moment. But the system that processed her from a traffic stop in Santa Monica to 6 years in a state institution was not designed to help her. It was designed to contain her. And the specific quality that made her most dangerous to that system, her refusal to perform acceptable femininity, her outspoken politics, her stubborn intellectual independence, was not a symptom of mental illness. It was simply who she was. The psychiatrists who examined her in 1943 and 1944 diagnosed her with conditions whose names have changed several times since then. and whose diagnoses were based on interviews conducted while she was frightened, intoxicated, and deeply hostile to the process itself. Nobody asked what had happened to her before she arrived in that courtroom. Nobody asked about the father who had left when she was 4, the mother whose ambitions for her daughter were more reliable than her warmth, the years of professional frustration, the drinking that had developed in response to all of it. They asked whether she was causing problems. She was. They called it insanity. They signed the papers. Behind the Pearls exists for this. Before we close, if you have stayed this far and this story has moved you, now is the perfect moment to subscribe to Behind the Pearls. Every week, we tell the stories of women the world decided were too much to handle. Hit subscribe so you never miss one. Frances Farmer was born in Seattle in 1913, the daughter of a lawyer who left and a mother who stayed. She wrote an essay that made her town furious and refused to apologize. She went to Moscow alone at 21 and came back more certain of herself than she had left. She stood on the New York stage and made a room full of theater critics reach for words they had never needed before. She looked at Hollywood and told it, consistently and without apology, that she had no intention of becoming what it required. And for all of that, she spent 6 years in Western State Hospital, subjected to treatments that left her racked with nausea and pain, and emerged to spend the rest of her life trying to describe what had been done to her, so that it might never be done again. She was not cured at Western State. She was quieted. Those are not the same thing. For the women who were too loud, too political, too certain, too unwilling to perform the compliance the room required. For the women who were handed a diagnosis when what they deserved was a conversation. For the women who spent years trying to describe the terror so that someone might finally be moved to stop it. Frances Farmer once wrote that the terror looms as large and evil today as it did in the despicable era of Bedlam. She was writing about the 1940s. She was hoping it would never be true again. If this story moved you, subscribe to Behind the Pearls and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The next pearl is already waiting, and her story is just as extraordinary. I will see you there.